Hi, welcome back. This is lecture 2 of our series on the technology of the self for module 3. So we're going to start off with a wee little bit of a game. What you are going to be doing is matching up these images with what you think is the correct procedure or something that describes it. So if you pop on over to our notebook, you'll see the matching game set up here. And as you can see, what you're going to be doing is linking up the image description with what you think is the procedure going on. So it's something a little fun for you to start with. I would recommend pausing this video here so that you can see the numbers and the images, and then bouncing on over to your web browser so that you can take a look at the notebook and try the game. So pause it now, and when you come back, we'll talk a little bit more about medical technologies and their effects on the body and self. Hi again. I hope you found that a little bit fun and somewhat informative. I'd love to know how many you got correct. Some of them are a little obscure. So what we're going to talk about now is just sort of some general trends to keep in mind when thinking about how medical technologies have impacted the human body and the human sense of self. And I think the best way to generalize it is to kind of frame it as a series of choices and trade-offs. So not all historical improvements in mortality and morbidity are the result of advancing technologies. In fact, the positive impact of these radical advances in medical technologies have actually been comparatively small. And you'll see that at play when we talk about two case studies in this portion of our lecture, when we look at the Jarvik 7 artificial heart as well as the birth control pill a little later on. So, when we consider that it's actually the gains in lifespans and improvement to the physical quality of life of people around the world has actually been due to things like better nutrition, better sanitation, better personal hygiene, and higher standards of living in general. So the idea that a piece of medical technology has entirely radicalized things is not entirely accurate. But with greater medical technologies, there are greater costs, and that can be seen individually and societally. So, two examples of some of the social costs to be considered. We're going to see this in a moment when we take a look at the case of Terry Schiavo, who was someone who lived many months in a persistent state of non-consciousness. And a great deal of debate was brought about as to, whether extending the human life is worth the cost, not just financially, but socially. Is it a life worth living if your body is being prompted to stay alive by ventilators and by feeding tubes and mechanisms? So there were deep moral questions that come up with greater advancements in medical technologies. And we also have the question of how do we decide who gets access to medical technologies? Some of the more radical technologies, like the Jarvik 7 artificial heart, are still not widely available in North America and in other parts of the world. And these procedures to research, develop, and of course be made accessible to people really come at not only an economic cost, but having to decide who can get these expensive medical therapies and technologies is a real concern. Economically speaking, and we're having to ask questions about how does a public healthcare system afford the expensive research and development costs in order to develop these new technologies. Citizens, are taxed, and their money goes to many efforts to develop a number of technologies, but how much do you ask individuals to give up in terms of paying their taxes in order to develop these technologies? So there are some deep moral questions that arise, especially with medical technologies. And it tends to be the case that our innovations and inventiveness with medical technologies are often out ahead of our moral ideas. So we constantly see stories in the news about how medication or technology X is allowing the extension of a human life or a life in a different way, but we find it at odds with our cultural norms or our moral intuitions about what a quality of life looks like. So understanding that medical technologies, generally speaking, can be envisioned as a series of choices and trade-offs, I think the biggest takeaway that, generally speaking, we can have when assessing the impact of a medical technology in society is to recognize that it is a halfway fix. There are many health-related technologies that offer the prospect of survival and relief from a fatal condition, but they don't cure it. They cannot cure it. We're seeing that right now with the therapeutics surrounding COVID medications and technologies. So things like antibody medications or the remdesivir, and what they do, they provide the prospect of survival and increase a patient's ability to survive this novel virus and relief from this, from the conditions of the novel virus, but it doesn't cure it. And whenever I think about halfway fixes, I think about poor George Washington, who suffered immensely on his deathbed. He had what is now a very treatable condition. He had a case of pneumonia and a lung infection, which now we could treat with antibiotics. His prospects of survival would have been easily made better had he have lived during the time of antibiotics. But unfortunately he didn't, and poor George Washington had been given a series of natural remedies by his medical doctor, including having to drink a concoction of vinegar and boiled up sage and rosemary, and having to gargle with vinegar and sage. And because of his lung condition, taking in liquids while trying to breathe caused him the conditions of suffocation. So he was just a miserable mess. And then on top of that, his doctor also recommended that his blood be let out of his body. So it's a practice known as bloodletting. And poor George Washington had about 5 pints of his blood drained from his body into a pail. as a remedy for his lung disorder. So, poor George Washington. This would be an example of how medical technology can be used as, sort of thought of as a halfway fix. So what I'd like for you to do now, I have two cases in case studies for you to look at. The first is on the use of an invention of the Jarvik 7, the artificial heart, as well as the case of Terry Schiavo. So you will find the videos that help you understand these radical medical technologies on our notebook. So you just click on the videos and read the caption and sort of keep in mind what I've noted on each of them. So how about you pause the video now, go and take a look at these short videos for these case studies, and join me back here in just a moment. Welcome back, everyone. So this is going to round off our discussion about how medical technologies affect the body and sense of self. So these are just a few examples of the ways in which health-related technologies serve as a halfway fix and get us thinking about medical technologies as a series of choices and trade-offs rather than something big and dramatic and life-changing on the whole. In what follows, we're going to talk about more positive cases that have changed lives in some pretty dramatic ways. And we're going to add on to our understanding of technology and the self as we look at the topic of how technologies affect human relationships. Okay, we'll see you shortly in video 3.